Imagine you're a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, the sacred oils heavy in the air, the weight of tradition pressing upon your shoulders. You've just been handed the most disturbing assignment of your career. The pharaoh's young wife lies before you on the cool marble slab, her stillness a stark contrast to the turmoil in your heart. But this isn't a normal mummification. You've been ordered to preserve her body in a way that defies every sacred tradition you've ever known, to perform an intimate, desecrating modification that makes your hands tremble. And the reason, whispered by the high priest, makes your blood run cold. This wasn't fiction. This was a hidden reality in a civilization where intimacy was woven into the very fabric of cosmic order, a reality so extreme it would traumatize the modern mind. We think we know ancient Egypt, the golden treasures of Tutankhamun, the towering pyramids, the powerful pharaohs. But here's what they don't teach you in school. This was a world with sexual practices so shocking that Victorian archaeologists, upon discovering the evidence, actively hid it from view, locking away artifacts and burning documents to preserve a sanitized version of history. What I'm about to show you will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Because the truth about Egyptian intimate practices is a disturbing tale of cosmic control, divine power, and the systematic use of sexuality as a weapon. For over 3,000 years, along the fertile, life-giving banks of the Nile, the Egyptians developed a society that operated on a principle utterly foreign to us. Sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every act of intimacy was potentially a religious ritual, a necessary function to maintain Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. Every orgasm was believed to be a conversation with the gods, every sexual position a form of prayer. This belief system completely erased the boundaries between worship and intimacy, between religious duty and personal pleasure. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a living god whose sexual performance was not a private matter but a public, political and agricultural necessity. It was believed he directly controlled the fertility of the Nile itself, the success of the harvests, and the very survival of Egyptian civilization. This divine mandate created an enormous, unrelenting pressure to constantly prove this potency through increasingly extreme and symbolic displays. The evidence for this lies not in the grand public monuments, but in the hidden corners of history, in cryptic temple inscriptions rarely shown to tourists, in papyrus documents describing practices too explicit for museum displays, and in archaeological discoveries that were deliberately concealed. The discovery that changed everything, that cracked open this hidden world, happened not in a dramatic tomb excavation, but in the quiet, clinical atmosphere of a laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team, still buzzing from the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb 3 years prior, was conducting the first detailed examination of the boy king's mummy. As they carefully unwrapped the linen bandages, their excitement turned to confusion, then to dread. The king's genitals were missing. Not merely damaged by time, not decayed, but surgically, precisely removed. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made by a skilled hand shortly after death as a calculated part of the mummification ritual. This was no accident, it was an intentional act. But Tutankhamun was not alone. As Egyptologists developed new techniques like radiography and CT scanning to examine other royal mummies, a chilling pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of similar post-mortem genital modification. Some had been completely castrated. Others showed signs of bizarre enhancement procedures, such as the insertion of foreign materials like gold or sacred resins. The most horrifying discovery came from the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. Forensic analysis revealed that the removal had not been post-mortem. The bone structure and tissue remains suggested this procedure had been performed while the young man was still alive, a brutal act interpreted not as a punishment, but as a deliberate and likely fatal religious procedure. Suddenly, ancient Egyptian texts began to make a terrifying new sense. Cryptic references to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife, and instructions for preparing the body for eternal service to the gods took on a horrifyingly literal meaning. The implication was staggering. The Egyptians were ritually modifying the human body to ensure its proper function in the next world. Yet, perhaps the most insidious layer to this story is not ancient but modern. When 19th century archaeologists first encountered this explicit evidence, they were so scandalized by their own Victorian sensibilities that they orchestrated a cover-up. They weren't just embarrassed, they actively suppressed the truth. Auguste Mariette, a founder of Egyptology, kept collections of explicit artifacts hidden away. Pioneers like Giovanni Belzoni, upon finding sexually explicit wall paintings in tombs, ordered them plastered over. The famous Ebers Papyrus, a crucial medical text, had over 40 sections dealing with sexual health and practices that were deliberately left untranslated for a century. For over 100 years, the true nature of Egyptian sexual practices was concealed not by ancient curses, but by modern shame. A prudishness that couldn't reconcile the sophisticated image of Egypt with the complex and often dark reality revealed by the evidence. But the missing genitals of the pharaohs were merely the opening to a deeper, darker chamber. They were the symptom of a system that reached down into the very foundations of society, a system that preyed upon the most vulnerable. Beneath the glittering surface of divine kingship and cosmic ritual, festered a system of horrific, institutionalized abuse. The belief that sexuality was a conduit to the gods created a hierarchy of exploitation, a pyramid of pain with the pharaoh at its apex, and the most vulnerable children crushed at its base. Royal children, born into unimaginable privilege, faced a particularly cruel paradox. Their divine blood made them sacred, and in this civilization, to be sacred was to be a vessel, a piece of religious property to be used. Ancient texts and temple reliefs, once properly translated, describe how elite families would dedicate their youngest children, some as young as 6 or 7, to temple service. But this was not a life of quiet contemplation. These children, known as shade bearers or divine vessels, were systematically trained in sexual techniques from an early age. They were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves but to the temple and the gods it served. The training was comprehensive, brutal, and psychologically devastating. Imagine a childhood not of play, but of relentless instruction in specific positions and techniques designed to prolong pleasure for adult patrons. They underwent forced flexibility training, their small bodies contorted to achieve poses that would please the eye and satisfy religious symbolism, often resulting in chronic joint injuries and spinal deformities that are clearly visible on surviving remains. Their diets were carefully controlled not for health, but to stunt their growth and maintain the childlike proportions that were so prized. Medical papyri, like the Kahun gynecological papyrus, describe the tragic physical toll this life took. They detail treatments for internal injuries, chronic infections, and traumatic wounds that no child should ever have to endure. Many of these young souls never reached adulthood, succumbing to complications from their service or to infections that ancient medicine could not hope to cure. But the horror was not confined to the temple walls. The practice seeped into the very homes of the elite. Wealthy Egyptian families routinely used their domestic slaves for pleasure, with children being particularly prized for their supposed purity and malleability. Legal documents on papyrus, bills of sale, and slave transaction records show that child slaves could be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, their value meticulously calculated based on their age, physical appearance, and level of prior training. This was not a shadowy underworld. It was an accepted, legally sanctioned industry. The psychological impact on these children is a wound that echoes across millennia. While they had no words for PTSD or dissociative disorders, the symptoms described in texts are hauntingly familiar. Survivors who lived to adulthood were often unable to form normal relationships, swinging between sexually compulsive behavior and complete emotional withdrawal. Ancient scribes euphemistically recorded their frequent early deaths as being caused by a broken heart or a sorrowful spirit, a poetic but devastating acknowledgement of their profound trauma. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire system was its powerful religious justification. This abuse was not seen as a crime, it was framed as the highest form of worship. Priests taught that sexual service to the gods, and by extension to their earthly representatives, was a sacred duty and a great honor. Families were encouraged to feel proud, even blessed, if their child was selected for temple duties, actively participating in a system that commodified their own children. The economic dimension added a layer of cold, calculating horror to the spiritual manipulation. Archaeological evidence from worker settlements near major temples suggests a mortality rate of over 70% among these dedicated children. This wasn't just abuse, it was a systematic industry of consumption. Wealthy patrons paid premium prices for access to trained child slaves, and this revenue stream became a significant source of funding for powerful temple complexes, creating a vicious cycle that incentivized the ongoing trafficking and training of children. This institutionalized exploitation, sanctioned by faith and funded by greed, ensured the system's survival for generations. But if the daily reality of this abuse is hard to comprehend, it was merely a quiet horror compared to the annual explosion of sanctioned chaos that was the Feast of Drunkenness. The systematic abuse of the few was a constant hidden current, but the festival was a tsunami that engulfed the entire civilization, a week-long descent into a frenzy that would shock even the most jaded modern observer. If the daily exploitation was the quiet, systemic horror of ancient Egypt, the Feast of Drunkenness was its loud, violent, and public climax. This annual festival, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, represented the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian sexual extremism, a week-long state-sanctioned orgy of violence, intoxication, and sacred chaos that would be classified as a crime against humanity by any modern standard. Its origins lay in a foundational myth of survival, the story of the lioness goddess Sekhmet, who was unleashed by the sun god Ra to punish humanity's rebellion. Consumed by a bloodlust that threatened to wipe out all of mankind, she was only stopped when the gods tricked her by flooding the fields with beer stained red with ochre. Mistaking it for blood, she drank herself into a stupor, forgot her murderous mission, and transformed into the benevolent Hathor. This story of salvation through divine intoxication became the template for a festival that encouraged, and indeed demanded, that every Egyptian drink themselves into a state of possessed frenzy. But this was far beyond simple drunkenness. The preparation was a sacred science. Temple priests brewed massive quantities of beer, but this was no ordinary ale. It was a potent psychoactive concoction laced with extracts of blue lotus, mandrake, and other narcotic plants known to the Egyptian pharmacopoeia. The resulting mixture didn't just lower inhibitions, it induced vivid hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, and a powerful sensation of divine possession. Participants reported hearing the voices of gods, seeing visions, and feeling their own identities dissolve, replaced by the spirits of deities. They believed that in this state any impulse was a divine command and any act was, by definition, a holy one. When the festival began, the meticulously ordered structure of Egyptian society with its rigid hierarchies and strict codes of conduct vanished completely. For 7 days and nights, the entire civilization descended into a controlled burn of anarchic release. Masters had sex with slaves in public squares. Married women abandoned their families to join roving, ecstatic bands of revelers. Children were not merely exposed to explicit acts, they were often pulled into the chaos, their participation seen as a form of divine blessing. Ancient texts and accounts from horrified foreign diplomats describe scenes of surreal horror. Intoxicated mobs would storm through cities, breaking into homes and dragging inhabitants out to join the celebrations. Women were subjected to violent group acts that were reinterpreted as religious communion. Men engaged in competitions to see who could maintain sexual arousal the longest, while in a narcotic haze, a perverse echo of the Pharaoh's duty to demonstrate divine potency. The violence was as extreme as the sexuality. The festival was a sensory overload of biting, scratching, and frenzied acts that left participants scarred and wounded, marks they would later wear as badges of divine favor. Some revelers died from internal injuries inflicted during violent acts. Others were trampled to death in the narrow streets by the overwhelming crowds. The religious justification provided a terrifying moral blank check. Priests taught that any act performed during the festival was holy because the individuals were mere vessels for the gods. Abuse became worship, violence became a sacred offering. The rape of a child was twisted into a divine blessing. The aftermath was a landscape of trauma. Participants, sobering up after days of intoxication, often had no memory of what they had done or what had been done to them. The psychological shock of discovering evidence of their actions destroyed families and shattered minds. Children born 9 months after the festival faced lifelong stigma as children of the gods, products of divine possession rather than human love. The economic cost was staggering. Entire cities shut down, trade ceased, and the harvest could be left to rot. Yet the pharaohs considered it a necessary expense, a vital pressure valve that released social tensions and reinforced the rigid hierarchy for the rest of the year. It was a week of sanctioned rebellion that ultimately preserved the status quo. Archaeological evidence confirms this darkness. Excavations at sites like Medamud and Bubastis reveal specialized temple chambers with built-in benches, easy-to-clean surfaces, and drainage channels, architectural features that suggest their use for the very group activities described in the ancient texts. This was not a metaphor, it was a brutal, engineered reality. But this system, built on such an extreme foundation, could not withstand the pressure of an outside world that viewed it not as divinity, but as depravity. The collision was inevitable, and it would shatter a 3,000-year-old tradition. The collapse of ancient Egypt's intricate sexual religious system began not with a bang, but with a cultural clash of bewildered disgust. During the Ptolemaic period, Greek rulers found themselves in an impossible position. To maintain legitimacy with their Egyptian subjects, they were expected to participate in the very religious festivals that violated every principle of Greek rationalism and Hellenistic modesty. The clash between Greek philosophy and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a crisis that would ultimately unravel both systems. Cleopatra I, a Syrian Greek queen of Egypt, attempted cautious reform, reducing the duration of the Feast of Drunkenness and imposing the first feeble limits on its public violence and sexuality. These well-intentioned edits triggered a firestorm of religious backlash. Egyptian priests argued that tampering with the sacred template would anger the gods, and they pointed to subsequent poor Nile floods, military defeats, and economic strife as proof of divine displeasure. The crisis reached its peak under Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt. She faced an impossible triangulation, satisfying the demanding sexual religious expectations of her Egyptian priesthood, adhering to the increasingly prudish political demands of her Roman allies, and managing her own Hellenistic sensibilities. Roman observers like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were utterly scandalized by the practices they witnessed, viewing them as evidence of Eastern barbarism and moral decay rather than deep religious tradition. Cleopatra's solution was a politically fraught compromise that satisfied no one. She allowed private, traditional versions of the festivals to continue for the priesthood, while presenting a sanitized, public-facing version to Roman diplomats. This institutionalized hypocrisy only served to undermine both Egyptian religious authority and Roman political trust. Tragically, the abuse of children became even more secretive and systematic during this period, as desperate elites tried to prove their devotion to tradition away from prying Roman eyes. Child slaves were trafficked in greater numbers, their suffering now hidden in underground chambers from which Roman officials were barred. The final brutal end came with the Roman conquest in 30 BCE. Emperor Augustus Caesar, a champion of a strict conservative moral code, was horrified by what his forces discovered in Egyptian temples. His response was immediate and merciless. He ordered the outright suppression of all sexual religious practices. Roman soldiers, acting on imperial orders, destroyed explicit artwork, burned libraries of papyri containing sacred sexual texts, and executed priests who refused to abandon the ancient ceremonies. But the Romans did more than just suppress these practices. They engaged in a systematic campaign of historical erasure. Temples were stripped of their offensive decorations. Papyri were burned not just in storage rooms but in public squares as a warning. Architectural features designed for religious sexuality were dismantled or buried. The human toll of this sudden collapse was catastrophic, especially for the system's most vulnerable victims. The children who had been conditioned from birth for a life of sexual service found themselves utterly lost in this new world. Roman records describe former temple children who, stripped of the only identity and purpose they had ever known, and burdened with severe trauma, died by suicide or simply faded away, unable to adapt. The survivors carried their scars into a changed Egypt, creating underground networks and secret cults that tried to preserve fragments of their traditions for generations, much to the frustration of Roman governors who reported ongoing problems with trafficking and illicit worship. This historical erasure set the stage for the final great cover-up, the Victorian one. When 19th-century explorers like Giovanni Battista Belzoni stumbled upon the evidence the Romans had missed the explicit wall paintings in tombs like that of Sipta, they faced a crisis of their own modern morality. Their response was not to study but to conceal. Auguste Mariette, founder of Egyptology, curated private collections of erotic artifacts that would never see public display. The famed Egyptologist Flinders Petrie openly admitted in his journals to destroying papyri and smashing artifacts he deemed too obscene. This suppression became the standard practice of institutions. The British Museum, the Louvre, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art all developed elaborate systems of secret collections, storing thousands of sexually explicit artifacts away from public view, often under deliberately misleading labels like miscellaneous pottery or objects of daily use. The famous Ebers papyrus had its most explicit sections deliberately mistranslated or omitted entirely for over a century. Academic institutions refused to fund research, and journals rejected papers on the topic. This Victorian legacy of shame and censorship continues to shape our understanding of ancient Egypt today. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions present a sanitized, palatable version of history, focusing on pharaohs and pyramids while completely ignoring the central, albeit disturbing, the role that sexuality played in their cosmology and daily life. The horrors hidden in the evidence reveal a profound and unsettling truth: how easily religious devotion can be twisted into systematic abuse when human sexuality is transformed into a mere tool for cosmic control and political power. For 3,000 years, this civilization built practices that treated children as property, normalized violence as worship, and weaponized intimacy. Their story is not just one of golden treasures and architectural marvels, but a cautionary tale written in hieroglyphs of suffering, a dark chapter that history has tried desperately to erase.